Damn, you do got a lot of these Warhammer models. You must play the game a lot.
Not really, unfortunately.
Man, you must be savagely ridiculed by all the other Warhammerers.
Nah, surprisingly few Warhammer players actually play Warhammer. I'm guessing I'm not the only one that fell off the wargaming bandwagon a bit when COVID hit because, well, we couldn't play games. And I figured I'd be able to jump right back on that bike again once the world opened back up and in-person games were a thing. But between new additions and more miniature war games than ever before, I became a deer in the headlights and just frozen, not playing anything. But I've made a resolution to myself to change all that this year with 4th edition Age of Sigmar. The game's got me hyped, most specifically the new Spearhead rules. Basically, with these rules, you can buy a single box of models in whatever faction you like and ease your way into learning Age of Sigmar with a smaller force. Less models to buy and paint, less rules to learn, an easy on-ramp to the full Age of Sigmar game. It seems like a great way to build up a new community for Age of Sigmar. So let's continue the work on our Skaven army today and get a little bit closer to a fully painted Spearhead force in something that feels pretty achievable. In last week's video, I kicked off the start of the army by painting up a full unit of clan rats, so I have some details of the army already figured out, and one of those is the Ruined City basing scheme that I'm going with. And it's always great to work with some slightly larger bases for your bigger models when you've got a basing scheme that really excites you, so I'm definitely enjoying having a bit more space to work with on the base of today's Rat Ogre. Now, in last week's video, I didn't get into model building at all, but there is an important thing you need to know about the models in this box, and that they are the dreaded push fit. Basically, they claim you can build everything in this box without glue because of this peg and hole system, but I tell you what, do not listen to them. I take all the pegs and snip them off with my sprue cutters to make sure I have a nice flush fit so the models will stick together perfectly and not have these thin gaps and lines running where all the pieces fit, which is what's going to happen if you just push them together. And then I just glued them together with my tried and true sprue goo process to ensure you can't even tell that the model was made of multiple parts. And if you're not sure what sprue goo is, I'll put a link to my video where I break down my model building process and why it's so valuable and pretty easy to use. Now, the Skaven Spearhead force uses a unit of 3 rat ogres, but these are much larger than your standard little rat men, and they have some hurdles that I'm not entirely sure how we're going to tackle just yet. So I'm just going to paint one of them today to really understand what I'm doing so I can knock out the last 2 at the same time later with confidence. And we're going to start off the painting trying to tackle one of those big hurdles right away. And it's one of those tricky little things that you may not even identify when looking at these models, but how important it is to really executing on them well. And that details the fact that these rat ogres have both a standard furry skin as well as torn away chunks of exposed flesh. And this may not seem like a big deal because, John, it's just 2 different surfaces, just paint them 2 different colors, but they are separate surfaces, and at the same time, they are actually the same thing, just different layers of it, so they need to feel that way in how we approach the painting. If we paint them too similarly, they blend together and the model will end up looking like a big, boring blob. But if we paint them entirely different, they won't feel like one is basically sitting on top of the other. I decided to mix in a bit of burnt red into my red violet for the shadow color of all the meat, and then use pure burnt red for the fur. By having a shared color in their shadow tones, these 2 surfaces will feel cohesive, despite the fact that we want a distinct separation between the 2. And as I'm painting these bright shadow colors on this rat, I'm reminding myself that this is going to end up being gray fur, but it doesn't really feel like that's what's going to happen. Ever realize 15 minutes into recording a video that your glasses are a smudgy mess and everyone on the internet is obviously judging you for your lackadaisical approach to glasses maintenance? All right, we're good. I'm trying to start out with vibrant, punchy shadow colors for this army so they all really stand out with a lot of pop at the tabletop, but it can be a bit tricky moving from such a vibrant shadow color into a more neutral mid-tone gray. That's why I'll be mixing in a bit of that red into the first layer to prevent too stark of a jump too quickly. As you paint different units and hero models in your army, you'll start to see the things that are similar amongst multiple different models, as well as things that are different. One thing that's different from this rat ogre than all the clan rats I painted before was that the sculpted fur on this rat ogre is a lot more pronounced, it's a lot more all over the model, so I need to take that into account in how I approach painting it. So while I'm applying these mid-tone layers, I'm using short lines following the direction of the fur on the model. This way we can enhance the feeling of fur with our brush strokes while we're just doing standard layering up on each part of that fur. And I'm going to avoid painting the face and muzzle of our rat for right now. I'm going to make that a little bit of a different color later. But for the rest of this fur, I'm just taking my time going through and applying this base coat while leaving just a bit of that red showing in the deepest shadows and recesses. I do want this gray fur to end up being fairly bright, so we have a lot of contrast on this main surface of the model. And now that we have a gray mid-tone down, we can jump to an even brighter gray pretty quickly. I'm just hitting each strand of sculpted fur towards its tip, and then the most raised areas where fur isn't sculpted, always being sure to leave some of that previous gray layer untouched. Now this process isn't fast, but it's not difficult or excruciating either. Just put on a podcast or a movie that you've seen a dozen times in the background and you'll get through it in no time. The thing is, we only have 3 of these rat ogres to paint for the entire force, and this fur covers the most surface on the entire model. So we can get this looking good, the rest of the model should fall into place. Now let's knock out his face really quick, and it's important to know that whenever 2 organic surfaces meet and their colors are different, that we have a nice natural transition between one of those colors and the other. That's why I'm using a bit of the gray color we used for the fur on our first layer of our flesh tone for the rat's face. And by doing it this way, we don't have to do any fancy painting techniques. We can just do the standard layering we've been doing throughout this entire model, and it'll look just great in no time. I do want the face to be brighter and warmer than the fur, so mixing in a bright flesh tone for our brightest highlights will go a long way to make the face stand out over the rest of the body. Today's video is brought to us by Milanote, an amazing tool that I found that helps me in both creative and organizational projects, including miniature painting. Milanote is a super easy to use software with a bunch of super helpful templates for all sorts of projects, both personal or professional. It allows you to collect notes, images, videos, tasks, and more all in one place. Starting a brand new project like, say, a Warhammer army is super easy with Milanote because it's got over 100 templates built in, so you can get right to the creative work quickly. I personally don't like using any software that gets in the way of my creative flow or has a steep learning curve, which is why Milanote really stands out to me. It's just super intuitive, and I get to just focus on creating my vision, not figuring out how to use the software. I've used Milanote for a variety of mini painting projects, from planning out my Golden Demon competition pieces to starting a new army out on the right foot. I built out a Skaven board in preparation for my new army, and it really helped me figure out my color scheme and build my confidence to start the army right. It's really cool because I can connect my mood board to my color scheme board, so I can just write down all the color recipes that I'm using for different aspects of the army and have them at all times. I'll put a link down in the video description to my board. Should you want access to those color recipes, you can look at them anytime. So if you want to spend very little time to make your projects, whether for work or for your hobby, that much more successful, please be sure to check out the link down in the video description to try out Milanote for free with no time limit. That's right, Ninja viewers get to use Milanote for free for as long as you want, because they just want you to use an awesome product and they know you're gonna love it. For the exposed torn flesh bits, I want them to feel more irritated, even bloodied. But I don't know exactly how bloody to do that. But for now, I can just build them up like normal skin, and I can always add more depth with nastiness later. Painting these sections proved to be tricky because they're both large, smooth shapes, but they also are broken up by these carved markings on the skin and major cracks, making it difficult to push the paint exactly where I want to without it flowing over into those markings, which I want to keep dark. For each surface, I'm always pulling my brush towards the center of the shape to ensure that the most paint is deposited there and we get a natural highlight on those most raised surfaces. Again, we want to keep some of that pure red-violet showing, specifically right where this flesh meets the fur, as well as in each of those carved out areas of the rat flesh. Carved rat flesh kind of makes me hungry for buffet prime rib. I don't know why. Maybe that's what it is. We're going to keep pushing brighter on this flesh as well. And my rule of thumb is when I think the section of the model that I'm painting looks good with lots of contrast, I take it one step further with one more brighter highlight. I know I've said that statement before, and I'm going to keep saying it because it's the number one easiest way to improve your miniature painting is just make sure your highlights are brighter than you actually think they need to be. And at this point, the skin looks a bit too much like normal skin, which is fine. That's what we were going for, because the plan all along was to glaze in some rich red toward the edges where the meat meets the fur. Meat Meats. It's a new app where you and other people that like meat can get together and talk about meat. Or maybe it's a completely different app. Now you're going to want to thin down your red paint a lot with water while you're doing this, or you'll run the risk of covering up all that hard work you just did. But man, is this a satisfying step. We add the nastiness and the smoothing out of our blends in just one brush stroke. Now on to painting this guy's rat skirt, and this is really the only bit of armor on the model that I'll use one of my army colors for my scheme with, and I've got a darker red, a ochre yellow, and this dark sea blue, and we're going to go with the dark sea blue because basically the rest of this entire model is really warm in colors, and we want to really contrast that with the blue skirt. I use my zenithal as a guide, putting the blue paint anywhere that isn't pure white from the zenithal, and then I come back in with a light tan paint to hit all the areas I didn't get with the blue, and then I blend the colors together right on the surface of the model. Now this isn't going to look good right away, and that's fine. The whole purpose of this is to add some depth and some dimension to our surface, showing some brighter and darker areas in a very quick period of time. We can decide how much we want to refine this, how many extra steps we want to put into it later, but know that you don't have to commit to a lot of time if you start with a wet blend. I just glazed in some pure black in the darkest folds and then create some scratches and edge highlights with a pure tan. It's amazing how rough your blend can look before this step and how great it can look right afterwards. One nice thing about getting a little momentum going in your army painting project is you start to get some recipes for some commonly used surfaces you're going to do all across the army. And that way you don't have to actually think about how you're going to paint a certain detail like all the metals on this model, because I've already figured that out from the last unit. In addition to my metals, I also have the weathering system established that I'm going to use across the entire army, and I can just reference where I have those written down either electronically or on a sheet of paper with those recipes if I'm ever not sure. And as you make your way through different units and models in your army, you'll undoubtedly have to add new recipes for new things you're painting that weren't on previous models. I used to think I would just remember all of this, but take my word for it when I say it's a big weight off your shoulders knowing it's written down somewhere, and you'll still know how you've painted those rusty silvers a year and a half from now when you add a new unit to the army. Our goal with the medals across this army is to help tell the story of these dirty, grimy rats. We want these medals to feel properly weathered, but we also want enough definition and crispness to them that they feel like they're cohesive with the rest of the paint job. I don't want the medals to take center stage, but I also don't want them to feel rushed. I like the number of steps I have for this process. There's depth and interest, and it actually can get done really quite quickly. Now on to something new that wasn't present in the clan rats, but it's really vital to a Skaven army, and that is the luminous, vibrant green warpstone. I honestly didn't really have a plan of attack and didn't know how I was going to approach this, so what I did was just took out some pure white paint and I edge highlighted and reinforced the brightest areas over the zenithal of these warpstones. And then I just came in with Carandrass green contrast paint. I figured this stuff would be a good foundation and I could build up more layers of white and fluo green paint to really make it shine, but honestly, I don't even think it needs it. This stuff really is a warpstone in a can, and it's kind of ironic because there's actually a contrast paint called Warp Lightning, and that's not nearly as good at the same job as this stuff is. All right, we're on to the home stretch now with just some important details left to do, like the beady little red eyes of our rat. I paint the eyes white and then coat them with Ball red contrast paint, and then finish them off with a pure white dot on the center of each eye just to make them pop, and then we're going to move on to the fleshy tails. I like a nice dark magenta as a starting point for rat tails, and then I can go to a middle flesh tone and then to a very bright one over 2 quick highlights, and with that, our rat ogre is done. Psych, the basing's not done. Actually, I use the same basing painting process here as I did on the clan rat, so you can check that out for the full details, but I did feel like the bases were missing a little bit of something, so I decided to add some really tiny grass tufts. I'm going to try to look directly in your eyes as I pick this up off the corner of the table. These tiny dark moss grass tufts are perfect to wedge in between the cobblestones of the city streets to add a little bit more detail and contrast in materials in the bases. I went back and added a few of these tufts to the clan rats as long as I had my tweezers and super glue out. And it's important to note that if you come up with an improvement or something you like while you're in the middle of painting an army, it's okay to go back and add that change to the prior units. And now our rat ogre is done for real. In the spearhead for Skaven, there is only 26 models, and with this model done, I have 11 complete, which is almost 50%, and now that I know how to do the rat ogres right, I can just replicate this 2 more times, and then that'll be 13 out of 26, and that'll be actually 50% done with my spearhead. If you haven't done a smaller army project before where you put in a little bit more effort, I really encourage you to try. It feels like each model is an achievement when the full army isn't such a huge hill to climb, and I've certainly enjoyed this project thus far with a more take your time and really enjoy the process approach. I've enjoyed painting an army this way much more than I have in a speed paint, try to get it all done in a week or whatever. If only the YouTube algorithm felt the same. But you're here, you watched it, thank you for checking out my videos, and thank you for subscribing to the channel. You obviously have great taste in Skaven army painting videos, not whatever that schmuck Vincey V is trying to peddle. Also, a massive thank you to my patrons. They were screaming for me to paint a rat ogre this week, and that info, along with a lot of comments I got in the last week's video, are the reason why this and every other video on the channel is able to be made. If you want to join us on the Patreon and the Ninja Discord, make sure to check out the link down below. You get some fun rewards for doing so. Now, I'll be back before you know it with another video, but don't worry, not every video on my channel is going to be Skaven focused going forward. You know, come to think of it, I don't know what I'm painting for the next video. So if you've got any good ideas, can you put them down there for me? Thanks. But sometime between now and that next video, make sure you find time in your day to slay the gray.